Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Sean Sanders, thank you so much for anchoring our class this morning. So good to see everybody. Let us thank God for the gift of learning Torah together. I think we have such an interesting question to talk about today. So let's get into it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bo charbonu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Okay, so here is the question that I want to invite us to think about. To what extent are you free? To what extent are we free to use our own moral judgment when facing a Torah law or a Torah precept that we really disagree with? Can we disagree with the Torah, and can we disagree with the Torah on moral grounds? Can we say, you know what, that was fine for the biblical period, but it doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for us now. Can we say our moral sensibility has changed or not? Now, what I want to do is this class is going to grow out of a piece of the last class about Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua. That is going to be kind of a laboratory, a clinical laboratory. It is a safe space to examine a contentious issue. When you look at a verse that is very troubling, what are your options? And you're going to see in this, and in this case, again, this doesn't really concern any of us directly, so it's kind of a laboratory. It's kind of putting something under a clinical microscope. It's kind of a safe space. It's offensive, but it's not our offensiveness. And what do you do with that? And you're going to see two very different approaches from Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua. And after we look at that for the first part of our class, I want to look at the issue of the Torah's prohibition against gay intimacy. And, for thousands of years, the Torah prohibited gay intimacy. And to this day, religious fundamentalists, won't bake a cake for a gay couple because of it offends their religious principles. We're going to look at the address for that. For the cake baker who won't bake a cake for a gay couple, we're going to look at that. The conservative movement, revisited that about 15 years ago and changed it. And the portion in which this law is found was last week's portion, Kedoshim. And the second part of our class, what I want to share with you is the reflection of Danny Nevins, who is a rabbi. He's the dean of the rabbinical school at the seminary. And in last week's commentary on Acharei Mot, he wrote a commentary which was very humble and very candid about what they got right and what they very much got wrong with their, revising how we see gay intimacy. So we're going to look at all of that. Okay, so that's our questions. Okay, so the first part is I want to just read out loud with you, and I want you to bring your good thinking cap on. And I want to ask you, the first part of our class is going to be to unpack this biblical verse and ask you what strikes you about it. Do you like it? Do you not like it? What do you think this is about? Okay, so I'm reading on page 1, Deuteronomy 23. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. None of their descendants, even in the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt, and because they hired Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Aharam Naharaim to curse you. But the Lord your God refused to heed Balaam. Instead, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, for the Lord your God loves you. You shall never concern yourself with their welfare or benefit as long as you live. You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your kinsman. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you are a stranger in his land. So And then it goes, children born to them may be admitted into the congregation of the Lord in the third generation. So I want to start with that. And this is the verse that was brought into the Talmud discussion last week that occasioned the debate between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua. But before we get to them, I want to get to you. What do you think about this passage? Anyone disturbed by this passage? Does anyone feel uncomfortable with this passage? Anybody? David Kopelman, thank you.
It seems a little unduly vindictive to remember to punish the descendants even unto the 10th generation because of deeds performed by their ancestors. It just seems a little bit petty to me. You know, I tell you, I personally have trouble buying any German products because of the Holocaust. And my wife says, well, look, most of them are dead today. So you can't punish the next generation for something the prior generation did. But I still have this feeling that I just can't get myself to endorse anything made in Germany. But I don't know for the 10th generation, that's the second generation. The 10th generation, it seems to me a little extreme. I mean, maybe there's some good people that came along in the 9th generation or the 8th generation. Right. To punish them forever because of the deeds of some ancestors.
Right. And not to mention, David, and we could have a whole class, we could have a whole semester on this, but Germany really did teshuvah. First of all, Germany is Israel's best friend in the European Union. And second of all, and I've never been to Berlin, I've never been to Germany, but I've heard from many people who have, including my wife and my son, that there's just a lot of teshuvah built into the very architecture of the city. So the notion that we're never going to forget, we're never going to forgive, right? That feels so it has a resonance here. What else do you notice about it though? Like, I mean, is there anything that is curious or inconsistent about this passage? If the Torah is going to get into the business of hating on people, if the Torah is going to get into the business of hating on people, what else do you notice about this passage that is odd or off? Arthur?
I certainly think that if they were going to be vindictive about anyone, they'd be vindictive about the Egyptians.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, don't forget, they were slaves in Egypt for 430 years, like slaves. And you remember your Bible stories from early Exodus when taskmasters would whip the backs of Israelite slaves. Avodah kasha b'forech, hard slave labor for 430 years. And yet that is not even acknowledged. And what is the offense? So let's go, by contrast, what's the offense of the Ammonites? Okay, so it brings two offenses to bear. Okay, one, they did not meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt. So they weren't hospitable. There should have been some kind bars and some Poland seltzer and some, some chips. Like, they should have been more hospitable. They should have gone to Costco, got a bunch of kind bars and bottles of water. They didn't do it, which is, I mean, it's not a nice thing that they didn't do it. It would have been nice if they were more hospitable. But how do you compare that to enslaving a people for 430 years? And why, if you're in the business of hating on people, would you say the people that enslaved me for 430 years, I'm gonna not hate them? And in fact, I'm not even gonna remember in this passage that we were slaves. Just that we're going to call it strangers in their land, but not slaves in their land, even though our whole story is premised on the fact that we were slaves in their land. But but Ammonites, because they didn't bring me kind bars, I'm never ever gonna, right? It just is off. It's just deeply off. It's deeply off. There's a few other problems. It says, the verse gloms together Ammonites and Moabites. But if you know your Bible story, it was only the Moabites, King Balak of Moab, that hires Bilam. So Balak, Moab hires Bilam to curse the Jews, but the Ammonites never hire anybody to curse the Jews. So they're getting, it's guilt by association. They're getting smeared for a sin they didn't even do. Okay, there's a third problem. So number one, it feels odd that Egypt isn't, we're not supposed to hate Egypt even though we were slaves. We're supposed to hate Ammonites for the seemingly mild infraction that they didn't bring us, drinks and snacks. And it gloms the Ammonites onto the Moabites, where it was the Moabites who tried to curse the Jews, not the Ammonites. There's one other problem here, which is, if you go back to the beginning, it says, no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. None of their descendants shall ever be, even into the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. Okay, for 10 points and a free bagel and kiddush when we're back in business. What biblical figure gives the lie to that verse in a very big way? David?
Ruth.
Ruth, right? Ruth is a Moabite, and she converts, right? Wherever you go, I go. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. Where you die, where you're buried, I'll be buried, right? And Ruth's son, or great grandson, 10 generations later, is King David. So in other words, you have a verse that says that no Moabite shall be admitted even into the 10th generation. And literally the book of Ruth ends with the 10th generation from Ruth the Moabite. And not only is he admitted into the congregation, he is the king of the Jews. He's literally the king of the Jews. So you have a complete refutation and a complete rejection of this passage by the Bible itself. The Bible itself says, whoa, not by me. The Bible itself says we're going to take the 10th generation of a Moabite woman. His name is going to be David. And not only is he not going to be excluded from Israel, he's going to be the king of Israel. Okay? So that's just a cursory critique of Deuteronomy 23. It doesn't make sense on its face. Why can't people ever do teshuvah? Why are you hating on the Ammonites for something they didn't do or for a trifling thing? Why are you not hating on the Egyptians? And in any event, we already know the verse is not true because King David is a Moabite 10 generations later. So first, let me just pause here. For any thoughts, comments, or questions about this Torah. Bruce. And Bruce, you're muted. If you could unmute, please.
Do you have any idea when the first phrases were written and when the second part of when David became king was written? How many years do you think transpired in the writing of the Torah?
Well, we know that Moses is around the year 1200 BCE. We know that King David is around the year 1000 BCE. So it would have been about 200 years in between the writing of Deuteronomy. Although but on the other hand, if you read Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Friedman, he'll argue that Deuteronomy is a later, so if you use, critical Bible theory, that the Deuteronomy was written, many centuries after Moses, that it was written in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and not in the year. So it depends on how you date it. But if you use a traditional dating, that Moses is 1200, David is, let's say, 1000. If you use a critical legal, critical Bible scholars, you would say Deuteronomy is written sometime in the 500s or 400s. But
That's why I asked. I'm reading that book.
I'm sorry?
That's why I asked. I'm reading that book now.
Yeah, who wrote the Bible? Yeah. So here's
Yeah.
the question I want to ask you. I want to ask you to imagine that your child or grandchild or somebody that you're in a teaching relationship with, a tender teaching relationship, comes to you from their day of Hebrew school, and they present you with this passage. And they say, what do you think of this? What would you say when confronted with a passage that just feels off? What would you say? And yeah, what would you say? And how would you handle it? Anybody want to hazard an explanation to a curious grandchild? Andrea.
Well, it reminds me of one of the songs that got an Oscar in the awards the other night, had to do with refusing hate. I think to be told that you should keep hate in your heart is a sickening concept for the person who carries the hate for so many years. So I think I would talk about refusing hate.
Okay, so in other words, Andrea, you don't like this passage because it contravenes a principle with which you try to go through life, which is not to carry hate in your heart, not to carry that kind of negative energy in your heart. Okay, and you would speak about it in that way. And then what would you say about the passage? If your grandchild says, but, grandma, nana, whatever they call you, but it's in the Torah, what would you say?
I'd say I'm on weak ground now.
Okay. Does any Paul, what would you say if Zoe comes home after Hebrew school and says, Grandpa, Papa, what's with this thing? What would
Well, I have had this issue with my own children, never mind my grandchildren. And what I told my children, and this was a long time ago, is that people in around when these were written thought differently than the way contemporary people think. That sociologically we have, and psychologically, we have progressed and we think differently now than the way people thought then.
Okay. And if your teenage daughter Cheryl was having this conversation with you,
Yeah.
and she said, Dad, I don't, and let's say she's channeling the vibe of our age, and teenage Cheryl Kayla says to you, this Torah law seems immoral to me. It seems to hate a whole people. It seems racist to me. What would you say?
I'd say from our current perspective, it is. But of the perspective of 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, or 2,100 years ago, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but Sean, can you fix that? All of a sudden, we've got a whole big, I can't see the whole screen anymore, Sean. Thank you. So you would say from our perspective, it does feel racist, but it was a different, that was then, this is now. Times have changed.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And,
Anyone else
can I
have
just
any comments on the passage at hand before we get to the rabbis and the Talmud? And it's going to turn out that how this curious and opaque and somewhat hateful passage is dealt with, you'll see the same moves with regard to gay intimacy. The same moves with regard to gay intimacy. Connie.
I would say that God gave us the ability to look at something that isn't right and to speak out against it. and that we have a moral obligation to use that ability.
Okay, so we have a moral obligation. God gave us our conscience, and our conscience is from God, and we have to use that gift of God, our conscience, to call things out as we see it. Is that what you're saying, Connie?
Yeah.
Okay, now I have a problem for you.
Okay.
In his book, Democracy and Distrust, John Hart Ely, who, when he wrote it, was a constitutional law scholar at Stanford, makes the point, and this is a very, I still remember this chapter. I read it, 30 years ago. He talks about how one person's morality is very much not another person's morality. He makes the case that slave owners justified slave owning on moral grounds. I mean, and he wrote this book a long time ago. Now, if there's obviously a lot of stuff like Caste that we read together. So you know this from Israel Wilkerson's book that just came out this year, 2 years ago, that not only did slave owners own slaves, they said it's right, it's moral, it's God's law. So too, John Hart Ely points out that Nazis justified what they did on moral grounds. So here's my question. When you say God gave us a conscience and we should call it out, what about the fact that your morality and the next person's morality could be very different? How do you think about that? You're still on mute, Connie.
There's construction going on, so it might happen as I talk.
Okay, no worries.
There's a moral framework within the Torah that I think we can use to reject slavery and to reject Nazism.
Okay, well, I'll let you go back on mute, but I will just say that during the Civil War, many a Southern rabbi gave sermons justifying slavery, using the language of the Torah, the curse of Ham, to say slavery is moral, slavery is God's intent. So I don't disagree with you, and but I want you to remember this conversation when we come back to the different moves of the rabbis. So okay, with that, let me pivot back to the Talmud story. We saw this a little bit last week, but we're gonna double click on this. So basically what happens is as follows, and I'll just summarize, but a guy comes named Judah the Ammonite. He's an actual Ammonite. He says, now he's not the Moabite. The Moabites get all the glamour because the Moabites have Ruth. But he's the first part of this verse. He's the Ammonite part. It says no Ammonite or Moabite, so Ruth takes care of the Moabite. He says, I'm an Ammonite. I'm the part that doesn't get any love. But hey, I want to join the Jewish people and I want to marry a Jewish woman. Can I? Okay. And now this is so interesting because what happens in this conversation in the Talmud that we saw last week happens all the time. Rabbi Gamliel says, you know what? My hands are tied. I can't help you because there's a verse. There's a verse. The verse that we just looked at from Deuteronomy 23. It says, no Ammonite can ever be admitted to the congregation of the Lord. Sorry, Charlie, you're out of luck. Wish I could help you. Can't help you. My hands are tied. See the Torah, Deuteronomy 23. That's Rabbi Gamliel. Now, here is what Rabbi Yehoshua says. Here's what he says, and we'll talk about why he says it. He says, hey. Who knows what an Ammonite is anyway? Because an Ammonite, when this was written, this was written 1,000 years ago, there was war, there was conquest, there was population reshuffle. So who knows if what's called an Ammonite 1,000 years ago is the same Ammonite now, And therefore, this verse doesn't apply to the current people who live in Ammon. Okay? And therefore, Judah, you can come on in because the Torah verse doesn't apply. It's still written, it's still there. I'm not canceling it out. I'm just saying I'm interpreting it away because of historical circumstances. We don't even know who an Ammonite is, so you're welcome. And the whole yeshiva says, yes, I'll go with that. So I want to just pause and note what Rabbi Yehoshua does not do. He does not do the Paul Kalis move. He does not do the Connie Gieser move. He does not call it out as immoral and hateful, right? What he doesn't say this law is immoral, this law is hateful. He says, I'm going to preserve this law. It's in the Torah. I'm not going to use moral language. I'm not going to make a robust moral claim. All I'm going to say is it doesn't apply because of historical circumstances. And that's the law that carries the day. So what I want to show you is that in a case that for us in 2021 raises clear moral issues, that the Torah seems to be hating on a whole people, I would not hesitate. I would not hesitate. I would proudly use the word racist. This is the Torah's racism. If this is not racism, what is racism? When it says no Ammonites ever, that's racist. I mean, that's just despicable. I hate that. This is not my religion. And I would condemn this in the strongest moral terms on the same basis as Paul saying, look, that was what they thought then. This is not what I think now. I'd keep it in the Torah. I would have it in there and I would just argue against it forever. They don't do that. They say, who knows what it is, but it doesn't apply because who knows what an Ammonite is. Now, that's this whole conversation, and I'll stop now for questions, is gonna reflect, this issue is not our issue, it's an academic issue, Ammonites. But you'll see when it comes to gay intimacy, it's very much our issue, and the same patterns are gonna recur. So let me pause here. What are some thoughts, comments, and questions about Rabban Gamliel, who says to Judah the Ammonite, no, because the verse says what it says, and Rabbi Yehoshua, who says to Judah the Ammonite, yes, because who knows what an Ammonite is anyway nowadays. Any thoughts, comments, and questions? David.
Well, if you, to go back to the question of one person's morality is another person's poison, or that kind of a concept, and including this, I suppose one filter you could use to determine what has merit and what lacks merit is if you just the simple thing that's also, I don't know if it's in the Bible or someone stood on one foot or what it is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you use that as a filter, you could never justify slavery by the South because you wouldn't want to be a slave. You could never justify Nazism because you wouldn't want to be in the shoes of the Jewish people. And by the same token, you could never justify what Rabbi Gamliel is saying, because if you reverse positions and put yourself in the other person's position, it's pretty clear as to what has merit and what lacks merit.
Right. Yes. And now, your argument, David, is you don't explicitly use the word moral, but it has the tinge of a moral argument. I mean, I want to treat others the way I would want to be treated. Treat others. That's a moral claim. And when Rabbi Yehoshua argues for allowing Judah the Ammonite in, he doesn't make that claim. He makes a much more limited claim, which is, who knows what an Ammonite is. In other words, there is a reluctance in the sources to make the kind of robust moral argument that you're making. By the way, and not to, spoiler alert, when the conservative movement, I'll just show you how this issue is so alive. This is not a theoretical issue. So for thousands of years, gay intimacy was considered an abomination. Okay. And while lots of stuff changed in Jewish law, that never changed. Okay, that never changed for thousands of years. So now, you know, in the late 90s and early aughts, there was a sense that this is wrong and cannot stand. So let's just take a look at the verse, and then you'll look on page 5 of the handout. This is the reason that, you know, fundamentalist cake makers don't make cakes for gay couples. Okay. This is page 5, verse 1822 from Leviticus. It was last week's portion. Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. And it's addressing this to men. So men, do not lie with another man as one would lie with a woman. To'eva, it's an abomination, an abhorrence. Whatever to'eva means, it's not good. Okay? And that simple verse caused untold pain and suffering to gay people for thousands of years. Leviticus 18:22. Now, so the conservative movement takes this up, 15 years ago, 16 years ago, and they have 3 options. And what's so interesting is the Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Gamliel moves get mapped on. Plus there's a third, okay? So the Rabbi Gamliel one is, I'm gonna look at the verse and say my hands are tied, right? And so that was written by Joel Roth. Joel Roth, who, by the way, I love. He's a great guy. I love him. He's a great teacher. He is a great Talmudist. I couldn't disagree with him more on the merits here than I do, but I love the guy. But he writes this teshuvah saying, my hands are tied. If we're going to be a halachic process, then since no rabbi in the last 2,000 years has seen fit to, can everyone go on mute, please? Connie, if you can go on mute.
Yes, dear.
Sean, if you can mute Connie, please. So one move, so Joel Roth says, the verse says what it says, and gay is not okay. Gay is not okay. And as a result of that, by the way, so what Rabbi Roth said, and this was the policy of the conservative movement for years and years. It was the policy of the conservative movement when I was in rabbinical school. So this is still in my lifetime. I was at the seminary from 93 to 98. Was that if you're a gay, you had 2 choices if you wanted to be admitted as a rabbi to the seminary or a cantor. One is you could lie and be in the closet. The second was Rabbi Roth's reading of this, literal reading, was the act that it prohibits is not the inclination to be gay, it's actual intimacy. It doesn't say, it says do not lie with a male. So that if you were gay, but you said, I'm never going to have sex because it's prohibited by the Torah, then you could be admitted to the seminary. So and Rabbi Roth continued to take that position into the 90s and early 2000s, that's my hands are tied. That's the Rabban Gamliel position. The verse says what it says. Okay? Then Danny Nevins and Elliot Dorff do a Rabbi Yehoshua on this verse. And they argue that this verse is in tension with the Jewish value concept of dignity, of human dignity, and not causing pain or humiliation. but they still see themselves as they can't use a moral voice. They can't say, just like Rabbi Joshua doesn't say this verse on the Ammonites is bad. I don't like it. It's immoral. They can't say that. They don't say that. So what they say is, I'm going to read the precedents this way and that way and this way and that way. And based on dignity arguments, what they do is they say, we don't see it anymore as an abomination. It's not toivah, because that conflicts with human dignity. But because of we're constrained by precedents, they have the following proviso in their law, which is gay men cannot have anal intercourse. So this is a teshuvah which specifically permits the concept of gay intimacy, but specifically carves out of that, you can't have anal intercourse, which of course is how gay men have sex. So the whole teshuvah is kind of a contradiction in terms it permits it, but then it says that the way that gay men actually express intimacy, you can't do. But in any event, that is what passes the law committee. Okay, this teshuvah that is kind of ridiculous if you actually know gay people, you know, and my two sons are gay, so it's kind of ridiculous. But it was a step forward at the time. Then there was a third position paper written by Gordon Tucker, who was at the time a rabbi in White Plains, New York. Gordon is probably, you know, the smartest, most charismatic, most articulate, deeply sourced, cool rabbi, you know, of the conservative movement of my lifetime. And Gordon writes this paper and he calls for normalization and just says that, you know, gay intimacy is just as kosher as, you know, heterosexual intimacy. And there can't be any, rabbis cannot be in the business of prescribing how they do it. Just stop and just say it's, and he writes a beautiful paper, and which is the kind of moral position. It's not a limited precedent looking at the different precedents position. It's an argument based on morality. And that paper does not pass because it's considered too, you know, too radical. People are uncomfortable with moral claims. Who says your morality? And so the position that says, no, we can't help you passes. The position that says, yes, so long as gay men don't actually have sex the way gay men have sex, that passes. And the position that says we're going to normalize and stop judging, that does not pass because that's considered too moral. So let me pause. That was the situation 15 years ago. And the last text that we're going to look at is the author of the position paper that passed, his reflections on what he did 15 years ago. But let me just first take some thoughts, comments, and questions. And again, I want to ask you guys your own comfort level at using moral language and moral categories in thinking about hard moral issues. So thoughts, comments, and questions, the floor is open. Okay, I'll put it this way. If you were on the law committee, let me ask a more granular question. You're on the law committee. Which position do you hold? No, yes, so long as they don't have sex, or just yes on moral grounds? Which one would you argue for and why? And then we'll look at what Danny Nevins has to say. Myrna.
I would, can you hear me?
We
Okay.
can, yes.
It would be the latter one, the most recent pronouncement, because we always grew up with the expression live and let live. And, you know, whoever is without sin, let him cast the first stone. our country is in trouble because that people are judging everyone else. We need more. What do I want to say? Acceptance and more kindness, and we need to be less judgmental.
So you would have voted for the, normalization paper on moral grounds of acceptance, non-judgmentalism, etc., and would have articulated those rationales.
Yes.
Okay. Other views. Paul Kalis.
Yeah, I would eliminate the concept of morality completely.
You would? Why?
Because gays have been around since the beginning of mankind. It's part of the system. And if you believe that God created human beings, he also created human beings who are gay, whose brain chemistry and sexual choices were governed by his or her laws. So it's nothing new.
Right, but Paul, I'm trying to understand your position. Would you say that arguing against discrimination is a moral concern?
Yes, I would.
Okay, so arguing against discrimination against Jews, Riverdale had all these rocks thrown at synagogues. Would you consider that immoral?
Yes.
Okay. Would discriminating against blacks because they're black be immoral?
Yes.
Okay. Then would discriminating against gays because they're gay be immoral?
Yes, that also. But
Okay,
I'm just
right.
All I'm saying is that religion in this particular case is tearing us apart, not bringing us together.
Right, but what is that? In other words, the question that I hear you saying is, let's say I think it's immoral to discriminate against a gay couple. What do you do with the cake baker who says, these are my convictions. I'm like Rabbi Roth. I'm like Rabbi Gamliel. I'm just going to read the verse and try my best to honor the verse as written. That's my moral conviction. And then you have, to many of your points, you have a society that is divided.
Well, he's really not hurting anyone. He is just emphasizing his particular beliefs. How is he hurting the couple? They can go to another baker. We're taking a tiny minority of people and making believe that they're huge in number. I don't believe that to be true.
Paul, let me ask you this question.
Sure.
You're the mayor of a town.
Yes.
I'm a black couple.
Yes.
I go to the cake shop and they say, I don't like black people. I don't want to make a cake for black couple. And I come to the mayor and I say, hey, this baker won't make me a cake because I'm black. Would you say just go to another bakery? Or would you say, I don't actually want that kind of hatred in my town?
I would do both.
Okay.
I would do both.
So you can see here, what's interesting about the conversation is you can see it kind of right away, it takes you to a moral place. I want to read some of Danny Nevins's reflections because he looks at all the issues that we've been talking about. So we're on page 6. And this is Danny Nevins, who wrote he's currently the dean of the rabbinical school at Jewish Theological Seminary. And he writes this last week. Okay. I'm going to read and we'll comment. And he's talking about the conversation we've just been having. When the Torah prohibits sexual intercourse between two men, calling their lovemaking an abomination. Now, let me just note there, language is so important. One of the sins that he apologizes for is that when they wrote the Teshuvah 15, 16 years ago, they always used the kind of clinical term homosexuality, which he repents for because he said it made gay people feel bad, like, like they're, like you didn't see us as a human being. And so he now calls that lovemaking, not homosexuality. Okay. Calling their lovemaking an abomination. There is no avoiding our discomfort and increasingly our disagreement with this ancient text. The rabbis gifted us with techniques of non-literal interpretation, and modern readers have offered more acceptable approaches to these verses. For example, they might be read to prohibit only cultic or coercive or unloving or incestuous sex between men. Still, the most honest and useful approach is to admit that these verses have been understood for millennia to condemn sexual intimacy between men. Today, we understand this ban to be hurtful and oppressive. What is to be done? So you see here a rabbi who is now 15 years later using moral language to deal with this issue. Hurtful, oppressive, etc. Okay. Now, I'll keep going. Every year, thousands of Jews present essays and speeches struggling with these texts, using them as a foil for our own evolving understanding of gender and sexuality. This itself is a redemptive response, but we also need to revise communal norms. Within conservative Judaism, we have tried different approaches, some effective, but not entirely satisfying. 15 years ago, I joined with two other rabbis in composing a responsum that placed the Torah's heteronormative assumptions in tension with its own teachings about human dignity and the value of intimate partnership in life. Okay? And stop whenever you have a question. But right, so he's now looking at so the responsum or teshuva or the legal decision. He wrote it with Rabbi Dorf and said what I told you he said. Okay, and now he's reviewing that. We argued that the Torah's declaration that it is not good for a person to be alone, its commandment to love one another as ourselves. That's what David Kopelman mentioned earlier. And its warning to avoid humiliating and harming others. We're all in tension with the ban found here on gay sex. So too with the expansion added by the rabbis on sex between women. The cultural assumptions of their time undermine some of the rabbis' most beautiful teachings about respecting, protecting one another. The ancient rabbi said, so great is human dignity that it supersedes the negative principle of Torah. As modern rabbis, we applied this powerful idea to our contemporary reality and to protect the dignity of all people in our day. Okay, now here comes the reflection. I would like to take this opportunity nearly 15 years later to appreciate the positive impact of our responsum and to revise some of its less beneficial claims. On the positive side, almost immediately after our paper was approved in 2006, Jews and other people of faith began to discuss sexuality through the lens of dignity. The tone of the discourse changed, certainly within our own denomination, and so did the policies. Synagogues, schools, camps changed their rhetoric, and queer youth, adults, and families were gradually and then suddenly embraced as dignified members and leaders of their communities. Our seminaries in New York, Los Angeles quickly shifted to admitting gay and lesbian applicants, as did our school in Jerusalem 5 years later. Dozens of remarkable rabbis and cantors who openly identify as LGBTQI now lead our communities, and we have benefited from a richer and more diverse covenantal community. It's hard to remember just how different things were 15 or 20 years ago. So I just want to pause there. Was anybody in shul on Charles Osborne's last Shabbos morning? Yeah, you remember that, right? Michelle gave a sermon about this. It's remarkable how much the world has changed in 15 years. It's 2021. This is 2006. And Michelle gives the sermon on these issues, arguing for human dignity of gay people. And our cantor at the time said he couldn't continue. And he walked off the bima, and 2 bar mitzvahs, and Dan finished davening Musaf. And that was the end of his tenure at Temple Emanuel after 18 years. So these issues were just so alive, 16 years ago. And one of the things that he says is, that Rabbi Nevins says, is how much the world has changed in those years. But now, so that's the good side. But now Rabbi Nevins is going to critique himself on what he didn't do, because the truth is, he changed the landscape, and it was nice to talk about dignity, but he didn't really make a moral argument. So I'm going to read what he has to say, but any comments yet? Okay. Sometimes a text from only 15 years ago can feel ancient. And I admit that this is true of my own work. By the way, I just love his humility. And I love his self-reflectiveness, and I love his candor. We use the word homosexuality in our title to signal a scholarly and unbiased approach that might convince skeptical readers, including fellow law committee members whose votes we needed. But for many readers, that term already felt passé and even hurtful in its clinical tone. We should have been consistent in using the language preferred by gay and lesbian Jews, for whose benefit the paper was intended. Our core halacha claim was that sexual orientation is a fixed feature for many people, and that the prior demand that gay and lesbian people suppress their sexuality and try to pass as straight was demeaning, cruel, and futile. As such, it violated the rabbinic principle of human dignity, causing shame and suffering, which are themselves biblically forbidden. In passing, we commented that for bisexual people, it might be difficult but not impossible to restrict themselves to the ancient heterosexual norms. This comment was problematic at the time and has caused pain and anger, which I deeply regret. Bisexuality is its own identity, often misunderstood, that deserves respect and protection from hurtful comments and policies. Our paper should either have included bisexuals in its conceptual framework or left their questions for a different response, much as we left transgender issues for a different project. The interpretation of Torah is an evolving and expanding activity. For millennia, male rabbis argued that only men were obligated to study Torah, and they fought to preserve their monopoly on the spiritual inheritance that rightfully belongs to all Jews. Men built this patriarchy, and men may be partners in the task of dismantling it. But it is the scholarship and activism of women that have been the driving force in this change. The same is true of LGBTQI and Jews, who have emerged from being objects of rabbinic interest to subjects and authors of Jewish discourse. The prior closeting and oppression of these Jews is an ongoing source of pain and shame. The new era of openness and gay pride is the beginning of a holier and a greater stage of Jewish history. In other words, so here's what I want to, I would love your thoughts on this, but the position that he now holds did not pass 15 years ago. The position that he now holds did not pass 15 years ago. And the position that passed was this very legalistic, narrow kind of position that he now distances himself from. So I just wanted to, again, invite your thoughts, comments, and questions about the fundamental issue of, do we feel comfortable using our moral sense in figuring out moral issues today? And when there's a conflict between our moral sense and the text, dealing with it honestly and upfront. Thoughts, comments, questions? Would love anybody's thoughts. Maddie.
I admire the flexibility. I think that really is very special. Being able to say that we can't live by rules that were set up thousands of years ago, and that we have to be respectful of the changes in mores. And I don't know that other religions are in that position, or all aspects of Judaism are in that in that position, but I really respect the reform and conservative movements for being able to do that. And I think that's what attracts a lot of people to that, to this type of Judaism, if you want to call it that.
Thank you, Maddie. Other comments on any of the issues that we've been discussing, and on Rabbi Nevins, retrospective of his own work. Mike or Annette. That's Annette, I think. Annette, you're muted. Sean, if you can unmute Annette, please, if that's possible for you. You want to just put it in the chat?
Got it. I got it.
There we go.
Okay, hi. So I was thinking that it's quite beautiful how Rabbi Nevins came upon a certain conclusion 15 years ago, and now he realized he didn't go the whole hog. He realized that it wasn't enough. What he did was fine, and look at the doors it opened, but he's doing it more. And I applaud that. And I think that maybe his sense of timing in the world was right. At 15 years ago, the best way to get this through, he was a man of that time, was to do this, to declare it the way he did. He used the word homosexuality. He realizes now, not 100%. And there are people that feel that way, the way we change all laws, that, you didn't go the whole hog. And so it takes me to a thing I once brought up with you, Rabbi Yitz Grinberg, who talks about evolution. And it talks about our way of doing things is it's wrong. That is one way. It's wrong. We got to change it. And oftentimes that causes a backlash as well. So this notion of going one step at a time, it's not all the way. But okay, let's do that. And then 15 years later, we did the other. And yeah, it would have been nicer if it was 5 years later. And, for those people who are experiencing it, yeah, go the whole hog. But I'm okay with one step at a time. And I think that was the point that Hitz was making when he talked about slavery and why we said, why we didn't, why when we stood at Mount Sinai, we did not say that slavery was wrong. The first word out of our mouth was about a Hebrew slave. So, that's that same argument and a little bit about going kind of one step at a time, because it's hard to change. Change is difficult. And sometimes it happens in revolution, and sometimes it happens a little slower. So I think that's okay, and I applaud him, and I'm okay with that.
Thank you, Annette. I think that's right. I think those are very wise words from a practical point of view. The truth is in the pudding, because the more robust moral claim was a fabulous position paper. I remember reading this by Gordon Tucker, who was a former dean of the seminary. He had great yichus, and he had great stature, and he had great presence. And, he stands a foot taller than any other rabbi in the room, both in charisma and in style and in genius. So he's ultimate charisma. And he wrote this paper. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is my God. This is my rabbi. This is my Torah. I'm signing up for this. But it was too radical at the time. Yeah. And so if people needed the more measured, step by step, one step at a time of Rabbi Nevins. So wise words. Any other thoughts on these issues of the day?
Question.
Andrea.
Well, on the issue Annette was saying, I think practical is good. In my heart, I have a hard time thinking about how people are suffering as we go from step to step to step. But I also want to make a point about the other aspects of our culture that have influenced our thinking, and particularly in the psychiatric community. Homosexuality was in the diagnostic manual, an illness, a mental illness. And being trained as a social worker, I was practicing according to that. I mean, it's horrible to even think about that. And I don't know when it got taken out as that, but I would love to see a letter from some part of the mental health community, like the letter that was written from the clergy about how people have the loss of dignity that people have suffered about that.
Hey, Andrea, I got a question for you. What's like that today that we don't even realize yet? In other words, at the time, you didn't realize that how terrible that was, and now you do. What assumptions are we making today that years from now, 15 years from now, we'll look at and we'll say, oh my God, I can't believe I thought that. Oh my God, I can't believe I practiced that. Oh my God. What kind of blind spots do we have today?
Well, we talked about it for weeks in terms of race and caste and not being clear what's been going on.
Yeah. Connie, your hand was up.
Oh, well, to build on what Andrea said, lots of times change comes through science and research, and lots of times the results are questionable. So yes, change is right, but I agree in certain circumstances with the net, because sometimes we make change and it's done without the proper knowledge or without the full picture.
Right. Yeah. So I want to end by not with a bow and not with a nice little package. I want to end with mess. I want to end with mess. And I don't quite know how to figure this out. I've been thinking about it. I want to ask you to think about it. Over the weekend, President Biden used the term genocide to describe what Turkey did in murdering 1.5 million Armenians at the end of World War I. And that's a moral claim. To say something is genocide is a moral statement. And no president before him had done it, of either party. And of course, it causes grave upset with Turkey, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure all of you remember the tumult this created at the ADL level years ago when the head of the ADL couldn't say it was genocide because that would have ticked off the Turkish government. So he said it was tantamount to genocide, and tantamount to genocide pleased no one, didn't please Turkey, and it didn't please the people who said it was genocide. So I guess, so a couple of things. One is how deeply emotional these issues are. Number two, Faulkner's observation about the past is not dead. The past isn't even past. And then number three, about moral issues. So I guess my homework for you is, how comfortable are you using your own moral voice when interpreting the universe? Tantamount to genocide is a measured, legalistic tone. Calling it genocide, calling something wrong, calling something immoral, calling something racist, right? Those are moral voices. And what's your comfort level at using that kind of language? And what are your cautionary notes in using that kind of language? And thank you for the class. We'll see you next week. Boker tov.